The night my son told me to leave, it was raining so hard I could barely see the front steps. I stood on the porch of the house that was not mine anymore, holding a small gray suitcase in my right hand. The same suitcase Archibald and I had packed together for our trip to Niagara Falls in the summer of 2018. He had carried it up the stairs of the hotel that weekend without being asked, the way he always did things, quietly and without ceremony. I had not thought about that trip in months. Standing in the rain, I thought about nothing else. Preston was behind me in the doorway. He was not looking at me. He was looking at the floor, at the space between his feet, at some invisible point that required all of his attention. He said, "Mom, you'll be fine." That was the whole of it. 4 words spoken to the floor. Thomasine stood a few feet behind him with her arms folded across her chest. She did not say anything. She did not need to. Her silence was its own kind of language, and I had learned to read it over the past several months. It said, "This is already decided." It said, "Your feelings about this do not change the outcome." It said, "We have been waiting for you to leave, and now you are leaving, and that is the end of it." I stepped off the porch into the rain. Here is what surprised me, and I have thought about this many times since. I was not surprised. That is the thing I could not explain to anyone afterward. Standing in that rain soaked through before I even reached the end of the driveway, I felt something I did not expect to feel. I felt awake, as if I had been moving through the previous months in a kind of fog, and the cold water hitting my face had simply brought me back to myself. I had known. That is the honest truth. I had known for longer than I was willing to admit, and I had chosen not to know because knowing meant I would have to do something about it. And doing something about it meant accepting a version of my son that I was not ready to accept. 3 days later, a man in a gray suit would sit across from me in a quiet office and place both hands flat on his desk and be unable to speak for 15 seconds. 15 seconds is a long time when you are sitting across from someone and you do not know whether what is coming is the end of everything or the beginning of something you cannot yet imagine. But I am getting ahead of myself. My name is Celestine Saunders. I was born in Akron, Ohio in 1956, the daughter of a man who fixed electrical wiring for a living and a woman who taught second grade for 30 years. We were not wealthy. We were what people in those days called comfortable, which meant the bills were paid and there was food on the table and nobody talked about money at dinner because there was nothing alarming to say. I met Archibald Saunders in the autumn of 1974 at a church supper. He was sitting directly across the table from me, and the first words he ever said to me were, "Would you like me to pass you the potatoes?" I said yes. He passed them. We were married 8 months later, and we stayed married for 46 years until the cancer took him. Archibald was not a flashy man. He was not the kind of person who walked into a room and drew attention. He was the kind of person who noticed things. He noticed when the kitchen faucet was dripping 3 days before it became a problem. He noticed when I was tired before I noticed it myself. He built a small construction company in Columbus from nothing, and he ran it carefully and without drama for 30 years. We raised our son, Preston, in a house with a maple tree in the front yard and neighbors who waved to each other in the mornings. What I did not know, or perhaps what I chose not to examine too carefully, was the other thing about Archibald. The part I only understood after he was gone. He worked too much when Preston was young. I knew that at the time, but I told myself it was necessary, that he was building something for all of us. And that was true enough that I let it stand as the whole truth for years. The reality was that I took Preston to the doctor alone. I sat alone at the school play and watched our son forget his one line, and I laughed and took a photograph and told Archibald about it at dinner. I taught Preston to swim on a Tuesday afternoon in July, while Archibald was in a meeting he could not leave. I did not resent it, or I told myself I did not resent it, which amounts to approximately the same thing. Archibald knew. He was not an unaware man. He spent the last years of his life trying to make it right in the only way he understood, which was not through conversation or apology, but through action, through preparation, through building things quietly that he hoped would never be needed. I did not know that yet. I would learn it the hard way, as most important things are learned. The cancer came slowly. In those last weeks, Archibald would sit by the bedroom window in the afternoons and watch the light move across the yard. He did not talk much. He never had, really. But the silence in those weeks was different from his ordinary silence. It was the silence of a man who has more to say than he has time to say it. 2 evenings before he died, the hospital allowed him to come home for what they called comfort care. The room was dim, and the equipment beside the bed made its small mechanical sounds, and I sat in the chair next to him holding his hand. He said my name, not Sally, not the shortened version he used most days. He said Celestine, which was the name he used when something mattered. "There's a card," he said. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Dark blue. No name on it, no logo. It's in your old brown wallet, the one you stopped using." I frowned. "What kind of card? When you need it, you'll know what to do." He paused. "Don't trust people over it, not even people you love." I thought it was the medication. Pain does that to a person, makes the mind wander, turns practical men into poets of a sort. I squeezed his hand and nodded the way you nod at someone you love when you want them to feel heard. I told him I would remember. I did not understand what I was promising. He died 2 nights later at 3 in the morning while I was asleep in the chair beside him. The weeks after the funeral were the longest of my life. The house held 46 years of accumulated presence, every corner of it, saturated with the specific weight of a shared life. I made coffee every morning and poured 2 cups out of pure habit, and then stood looking at the second cup until it was cold. Preston began visiting more often. He brought groceries without being asked. He fixed the loose railing on the back steps. He sat across from me at dinner, and we talked about nothing in particular, the way people talk when the important things are too large and too recent to approach directly. Thomasine came with him sometimes. She was always polite, always composed, always dressed as if she had somewhere more important to be, but had chosen to be here instead. She asked me questions about my life with Archibald, about how we had met, about the early years of our marriage. She was a good listener. She had the particular skill of making you feel that what you were saying was interesting and important. I see now what I could not see then. A good listener and a person who cares about what you are saying are not always the same thing. One evening, Preston sat across from me and said that the house was too much for one person. He said I should not be alone. He said he and Thomasine had talked about it, and there was a room in their house, a good room, and they wanted me to come and stay. I resisted. The house was Archibald in some way I could not fully articulate. Leaving it felt like a second loss. But loneliness is a weight that accumulates, and after another 2 weeks of cold second cups of coffee, I gave in. I sold the house. I packed 46 years into a storage unit and 3 suitcases, and I moved into Preston and Thomasine's house in a quiet suburb just east of Columbus, carrying the gray suitcase from Niagara Falls and telling myself this was what families did. This was how things healed. The first weeks were warm. I have to say that clearly because it matters. The warmth was real, or real enough that I could not tell the difference. Thomasine had prepared a room for me on the second floor. New sheets, soft lighting, a small vase of white flowers on the nightstand. It looked like a photograph from a home decorating magazine. She stood in the doorway when she showed it to me and said, "We want you to feel at home." And something in the delivery of those words, the careful way she said them, made me feel for just a moment like crying with relief. We had dinners together. Preston asked about my day. Thomasine made tea in the evenings and sat across from me in the living room and asked me questions about my younger years, about where Archibald and I had lived when we were first married, about what our first house had been like, about whether we had any other property, any investments that had accumulated over the years. The questions were woven into ordinary conversations so smoothly that I did not register them as a pattern until much later. I was talking about my life. What was more natural than that? What was more natural than a daughter-in-law wanting to know the history of the family she had married into? I know what was happening now, but I am trying to tell you what it felt like from inside, and from inside it felt like belonging. A neighbor named Mabel Radford stopped by one afternoon during those first weeks, the way Mabel had always stopped by without warning and carrying something baked. She was 71 years old and had lived next door to Archibald and me for 22 years and had never once in those 22 years knocked before entering if the door was unlocked. She set a loaf of zucchini bread on the kitchen counter and looked at Thomasine's car in the driveway and said, "That's the third time this week." I told her Thomasine was being kind, helping me settle in. Mabel made a sound that was not quite agreement. People don't visit their mothers-in-law 3 times a week unless they're looking for something. I told her she was suspicious by nature. She picked up her purse and looked at me with the direct expression of a woman who had earned the right to say exactly what she thought. "I've lived 71 years," she said. "I know what genuine concern smells like, and I know what the other thing smells like." She left without finishing her tea. I did not think about what she had said until much later. What I did not know then was how right Mabel was and how much that knowledge would cost her before it could help either of us. Pastor Cornelius Kimball came by once during those early weeks. He was the minister at the Baptist church Archibald and I had attended for 30 years. 65 years old, gray at the temples, the kind of man who chose his words slowly because he understood their weight. He sat in my kitchen and drank coffee, and after a while he said something that I stored away without understanding. "Grief makes us suggestible," he said. "It makes us want to believe that the people offering help are offering it for the right reasons. That wanting is so strong that it can override a great deal of evidence." I did not know what to do with that at the time. I thanked him for coming. He said he would check in again. He did not say when. I have thought about that conversation many times since. He saw something I refused to see. He said it as plainly as a man of his particular restraint was capable of saying it, and I set it aside like a letter I meant to answer and kept putting off. The changes came slowly. That is the thing about this kind of situation that is so difficult to explain to people who have not been inside it. There is no single moment when everything shifts. There are only small adjustments, each one individually reasonable, each one arriving with a plausible explanation attached. In the fourth week, Thomason began intercepting the mail. Not dramatically, not with any announcement. She was simply in the right place at the right time, and she would say, "Oh, I'll take care of that." And the mail would disappear into her organizational system and emerge later as paid bills or filed paperwork, or sometimes not at all. "You shouldn't have to worry about all of this," she told me. "Let us handle it." In the sixth week, she suggested that managing my pension and household expenses together would simplify everything. It sounded reasonable. It was the kind of arrangement that made practical sense, and I trusted Preston, and Preston trusted Thomasine, and that chain of trust seemed sufficient. One afternoon, I decided to test it. I asked Thomasine casually about my pension statement. I had not seen one in 2 months. "Oh, I switched everything to paperless," she said without looking up from her coffee. "It's all digital now, much simpler." Can I see the account online? Of course. I'll set that up for you this week. She smiled. It was a complete smile, practiced and warm. There's nothing to worry about. I brought it up again 3 days later in front of Preston. He shrugged without looking at me. Thomasine handles all that. She's better with the financial side of things. He said it the way you say something you have been told to believe. I watched his face as he said it and saw nothing behind the words. Not evasion, not discomfort, nothing. That nothing was more alarming than any specific lie would have been. I never got access to the online account. Later, I would understand why. In the 8th week, Thomasine stood in the doorway of my bedroom with her arms folded and suggested that I move to the room on the ground floor. Fewer stairs, safer. I looked at her. I have used stairs for 68 years without a problem. She smiled, and the smile was patient in the way that a professional smile is patient. You have, she said, and you've done many things your whole life, but things change. It was not what she said. It was the category she was placing me in with those words. Fragile, past usefulness, a problem to be managed rather than a person to be considered. Preston stood behind her and said nothing, and that nothing was louder than anything he could have spoken. I moved downstairs the next day. The room was smaller and darker and positioned at the far end of the house, tucked away where it would not disturb anyone. It was not a room designed for comfort. It was a room designed for containment. I began to notice other things after the move. The way conversations would stop when I entered a room. The way Preston's phone would disappear into his pocket when I came into the kitchen. The way Thomasine would sometimes look at me with a particular expression I had not been able to name at first, but which I now recognized as calculation. She was not looking at me. She was looking at a problem in progress. 2 weeks later, I could not sleep. I went to the kitchen at 1 in the morning to get a glass of water, and through the partially open door of the living room, I heard Thomasine's voice, low and deliberate, speaking to someone on the phone. We just need her to sign it, she said. Once she signs, the transfer is clean. A pause, then, no, she doesn't understand any of it. That's the whole point. I stood in the dark kitchen for a long moment. The refrigerator hummed. A clock ticked somewhere in the house. I was very still, and I was thinking, and I was no longer foggy or exhausted or softened by grief. I was clear in the way that cold water makes you clear. I went back to my room and lay down on the bed and did not sleep for the rest of the night. Not because I was afraid, because I was thinking for the first time in months, genuinely thinking, working through what I had been watching and failing to name. 3 days after that, I found the card. I was organizing the last of my boxes in the downstairs room, working through things I had not touched since the move, and at the bottom of one box was the brown leather wallet I had stopped carrying when Archibald died. It had been his gift to me on our 20th anniversary, and I had carried it for years, and when he was gone, I could not look at it without feeling the absence like a physical weight, so I had set it aside. Inside the wallet, in the slim pocket behind the card slots, there was a card, dark blue, no name, no logo, only a faint metallic strip that caught the light when I turned it. Archibald's voice came to me so clearly that I turned around to look behind me. Don't trust people over it, not even people you love. I held the card in both hands for a long time. What I felt was not grief, and it was not fear. For the first time since Archibald had died, standing in that small, dim room that had been designed to keep me out of sight, I felt something closer to clarity. I did not use the card immediately. I kept it in the inside pocket of my winter coat for 2 more days, while I watched and waited and thought. On the second morning, I went to the kitchen early before Thomasine was awake, and I found a stack of documents on the counter near the candy maker. I told myself I was not snooping. I told myself I was simply in the kitchen, and the documents were simply there. My name was printed at the top of the first page. I picked up the stack and began to read. It was a power of attorney document, the language dense and legalistic, but not impenetrable. What it said, stripped of the formal phrasing, was this: all financial authority over Celestine Saunders' assets would be transferred to Thomasine Saunders effective upon signature. At the bottom of the last page, there was a signature line with my name already partially filled in. The handwriting was not mine. It was not even close to mine. My name forged in my own house on a document that would have signed away everything I had. I heard footsteps in the hallway, and I placed the documents back exactly as I had found them, face-up, edges aligned, the way a person places something when they want no evidence of having touched it. I turned to the counter and filled the kettle with water. Thomasine walked in wearing her robe and said, "Good morning." "Good morning," I said. She moved to the cabinet and took down a coffee mug. I kept my back half turned and my hands busy with the kettle and the stove. The room was completely ordinary. The morning was completely ordinary, and we were two women who both knew something that neither of us was going to acknowledge, standing 3 feet apart in a kitchen that smelled like clean dish soap and whatever Thomasine had made for dinner the night before. That was the moment, not the night I heard her on the phone, and not the night I stood in the rain with the suitcase. This moment in the kitchen, this utterly quiet and unremarkable morning, was when everything became irreversible in my mind. They were not taking care of me. They had never been taking care of me. They were managing a process, and I was the thing being managed, and I had been living in the middle of it the entire time, thanking them for their help. I thought about Mabel standing in my kitchen with her zucchini bread, saying she knew what the other things smelled like. I thought about Pastor Kimball saying that grief makes us suggestible. I thought about Archibald watching the light move across the yard in those last quiet weeks, already knowing what was coming and already preparing for it in the only way he knew how. That night, I did not sleep. I lay in the small dark room at the far end of the house, and I thought, and I made a decision. I waited until 4 in the morning when the house was completely still. I dressed in the dark. I took my identification, my medication, the photograph of Archibald that I kept on the nightstand, and the blue card. I packed a small number of clothes into the gray suitcase from Niagara Falls. I opened the door to the hallway. The house was silent. I moved through it carefully, past the kitchen where the forgery had been sitting on the counter, past the living room where Thomasine had spoken into the phone in the night, through the front door and down the porch steps and onto the wet street. I pulled the suitcase behind me, and I did not look back at the house. At the end of the street, waiting for the cab I had called from my phone, I looked down at the suitcase in my hand. Archibald had carried this up every staircase in every hotel we had ever stayed in together. He had swung it into overhead compartments on airplanes. He had set it on the bed and unzipped it for me without being asked every single time for 23 years of traveling together. And now I was pulling it through the dark and the rain at 4 in the morning, leaving my son's house with no clear plan and a blue card I did not yet understand. What I noticed standing there was that my hands were steady, my breathing was calm. I was 68 years old, and I was standing in the rain with a suitcase and nowhere to go, and I was not shaking. I was thinking. That was when I knew something had shifted. I had come through the fatigue of the past months and arrived at something harder and clearer on the other side. The cab came. I got in. I told the driver to take me to the nearest motel. And as we pulled away from the street, I reached into my coat pocket and felt the edge of the blue card between my fingers. Whatever Archibald had left for me, I was ready to find it. Part 2. The motel room cost $49 a night. It had a single lamp on a pressed wood nightstand, a television bolted to the dresser, and a bathroom that smelled faintly of industrial cleaner. Celestine sat on the edge of the bed and placed the blue card on the table in front of her, and looked at it the way you look at a locked door when you do not yet have the key, but you are reasonably certain the key exists. She picked up her phone and searched. She tried combinations of words. She half remembered fragments of conversations from years ago. Archibald had mentioned a bank name once 5 years before he died. She had been in the kitchen and he had been on the phone in the hallway, and she had heard one sentence before the conversation moved away from her. She had not asked about it. She had been stirring something on the stove, and she had let it pass the way you let 100 small things pass in a long marriage, trusting that whatever it was handled. She typed the name into her phone. A branch address came up, 4 miles away. She set the phone face down on the bed and sat with that for a moment. 4 miles. Archibald had chosen a branch 4 miles from where she would eventually end up. She thought he knew. Not every detail, but enough. He had been planning for a destination he hoped she would never need to reach, and he had placed the map close enough that she could find it. She did not sleep. She lay on top of the bedspread in her clothes and waited for morning. The First Commonwealth branch sat on a quiet corner between a dry cleaner and a pharmacy. Single-story modest sign, 4 cars in the lot when Celestine pulled in at 9 in the morning. She had taken a cab from the motel and she walked through the glass doors carrying nothing but her purse and the blue card held between 2 fingers. The teller was young, maybe 25, with her name on a small badge, Ashley. She took the card with both hands and turned it over once, then again. Something shifted in her expression, a small recalibration, a brief moment where her professional composure met something it did not recognize. "I'm not sure our system will have this on file," she said. "Let me run it through." She inserted the card into the reader. The machine was quiet for 3 seconds. Then it beeped once, a sharp, single tone, and Ashley's face changed completely. She did not say anything. She pulled the card out, looked at the screen, looked at the card again. Then she said, "One moment, please." And she stood up and walked quickly toward the glass office at the back of the room. Celestine watched through the window. A man in a gray suit was sitting behind a desk. He listened to Ashley for about 10 seconds. Then he looked at the screen she was pointing to. He placed both hands flat on the desk and went completely still. 15 seconds, Celestine counted. He stood up and walked toward her. His name was Fletcher Caldwell. He was 54 years old and he carried himself with the particular steadiness of a man who had spent 3 decades managing other people's money and had learned that most surprises were manageable. This one was not in that category. "Mrs. Saunders," he said. It was not quite a question. "Yes, would you come with me for a moment?" She followed him into the office. He closed the door. He gestured to the chair across from his desk, and then he sat down and looked at the card in his hand, and then at the screen in front of him, and then he turned the monitor so she could see it. Numbers. Large numbers organized in columns with a total at the bottom that Celestine read once and then had to read again because the first reading did not produce a coherent response in her mind. $7,340,000. "That can't be right," she said. "It is," Caldwell said. He said it quietly with no drama, which somehow made it more real than if he had announced it. "This account was established by your husband Archibald Saunders approximately 3 years ago. It has been continuously maintained since then." Archibald ran a small construction company. "We lived in a 2-story house with a maple tree in the yard." "Yes," Caldwell said. "In over 30 years with consistent reinvestment and several strategic decisions made at the right times that a person can build something significant. Your husband was very careful, very patient." Celestine looked at the number on the screen. She thought about Archibald paying every bill on time for 46 years. She thought about him setting the bed and unzipping the suitcase without being asked. She thought about the list he must have been running through in those last quiet weeks by the window, making sure nothing was forgotten. He had not been saying goodbye. He had been making sure everything was in place. Why didn't I know? She asked. Caldwell folded his hands on the desk. Because he designed it that way. The account cannot be accessed without your physical presence and this specific card. No exceptions, no family members, no legal representatives, no one acting on your behalf. Only you in person with the card. The word family landed with a particular weight. Has anyone tried? She asked. Caldwell opened a folder that had been sitting to the right of his keyboard, already prepared, as if he had been expecting this question for some time. About 2 months after your husband's passing, a man identifying himself as Preston Saunders contacted this branch requesting information about any accounts associated with Archibald Saunders. Celestine's hands tightened on the arms of the chair. He was told that no information could be released without proper authorization, Caldwell continued. He returned on 2 subsequent occasions with documentation attempting to establish himself as a legal beneficiary. Our legal team reviewed the signatures on those documents. He paused. They did not match verified records. The requests were denied and the account was flagged. Flagged for what? Potential fraud, Caldwell said. The word did not shock her. She heard it and felt a kind of cold settling, a confirmation of something she had already known in the wordless part of herself for months. And Thomasine? She asked. He turned to the next page in the folder. She accompanied him on the third visit. She presented herself as his spouse and argued for shared access on those grounds. The argument was rejected. He looked at Celestine over the top of the folder. Mrs. Saunders, your husband was meticulous. He left something else, didn't he? She said. It was not a question. Caldwell reached into the folder and removed a small white envelope. Her name was written on the front in Archibald's handwriting. The same handwriting that had signed birthday cards for 46 years, that had written notes tucked into her coat pockets on cold mornings, that had addressed Christmas cards in December with the same deliberate pen strokes every single year. This was placed in secure storage with the trust documents, Caldwell said. Instructions specified it was to be given to you only upon successful account verification. He set it on the desk and stood. I'll give you some privacy. He closed the door behind him. Celestine sat alone with the envelope for a long moment. She picked it up and opened it. One page folded twice. Archibald's handwriting steady and familiar. Celestine, it began. She read it slowly. He wrote that he had not told her because the account needed to remain untouched. Hidden from everyone because he had seen things. Changes in behavior. Questions asked when she was not in the room. A pattern that had become impossible to ignore. He wrote that 6 months before his final hospitalization, Preston had come to see him and asked him to transfer control of the company early. He wrote that he had looked at his son in that moment and seen something that broke his heart and that he was not certain whether to blame the boy Preston had become or the father he himself had failed to be. He wrote that the account was not just money, it was freedom. It was the ability to say no and mean it. It was the ability to leave and survive the leaving. He wrote that he had arranged for a private investigator named Garrison Ashworth, that Ashworth had been working for 18 months and knew everything, and that Ashworth was still available and waiting. He wrote, "You have always trusted too easily. That is one of the things I love most about you. But it is also the reason I could not leave you without this." He wrote, "I loved you. Not well enough for too long, better now." Celestine set the letter down on the desk. She looked out the window at the parking lot, at the ordinary cars, and the ordinary Tuesday morning, at a woman crossing the lot with a bag of dry cleaning over one arm. She did not cry. She had moved past the place where crying was the appropriate response to Archibald. What she felt was something more complicated than grief. It was gratitude and anger and a kind of retroactive tenderness for a man who had spent his last months on earth sick and frightened, and still managing, still building, still trying to repair the thing he had broken a long time ago. She folded the letter and put it back in the envelope and put the envelope in her purse. Then she opened the office door and told Fletcher Caldwell that she needed to know everything. Garrison Ashworth was leaning against a dark sedan in the bank parking lot when Celestine came out 40 minutes later. He was 47 with a plain, watchful face and the kind of stillness that comes from years of observing without being observed. He was wearing a flannel shirt and carrying a paper coffee cup, and he looked nothing like the private investigators in the movies Archibald had occasionally watched on Sunday afternoons. "Mrs. Saunders," he said, "I've been expecting your call." "I didn't call. Caldwell did. He said you were here." He held up the coffee cup slightly. "I've been in the area for the past week. I had a feeling the timeline was moving." He drove to a diner 2 blocks away, and they sat in a corner booth, and he put a folder on the table between them with the practiced motion of a man who had done this many times. "Before I show you this," he said, "I need to tell you something that isn't in the file." She waited. Thomasine Saunders is not making her first attempt. The diner was warm and smelled like bacon and coffee, and Celestine felt the room reorganize itself around those 6 words. Ashworth opened the folder to a section near the back, a photograph printed on standard paper. A man in his 70s at a restaurant table laughing at something. Beside him, a woman whose face Celestine recognized with a physical jolt, the way you recognize something you were not expecting to see. Thomasine. Younger by perhaps a decade, but unmistakably Thomasine. The same composed posture, the same quality of focused attention directed at the person across the table. His name was Herschel Colby, Ashworth said. 74 years old, widower, Pittsburgh. Thomasine moved in with him in 2011. 2 years later, he signed a comprehensive power of attorney transferring financial authority to her. 6 months after that, he began showing cognitive symptoms: memory loss, confusion, difficulty managing daily tasks. His physicians diagnosed Alzheimer's. There was no family history of the disease. Celestine looked at the photograph. Herschel Colby was laughing. He was leaning forward, animated the posture of a man who felt entirely at ease. That ease had cost him everything. Herschel died in 2015, Ashworth said. His estate was nearly depleted. His daughter, a woman named Trudy Colby, filed a civil suit. She ran out of money to pursue it and withdrew the claim. No criminal charges were ever filed. Thomasine moved to Columbus the following year. He looked at Celestine across the table. "Where she met your son." The cold anger that had settled in Celestine at the bank was different from what she felt now. That had been the anger of a woman who had been betrayed by her family. This was something larger and colder. This was not impulsive. This was not opportunistic. This was a practiced method refined over years applied to vulnerable people at the worst moments of their lives. And the woman who had sat across from her every evening and asked about Archibald with such attentive interest had done it before. "Your husband suspected," Ashworth said. "He found references to the Pittsburgh situation about 18 months before he died. That's when he hired me. He wanted documentation of everything. He wanted to make sure that if Thomasine ever tried to access the trust, there would be enough evidence to stop her." "Why didn't he tell me any of this?" Ashworth looked at her steadily. "He said you would try to fix it. He said you would talk to Preston, and Preston would talk to Thomasine, and she would know the investigation existed and cover her tracks. He wanted the documentation complete before anyone knew." Celestine understood now what Archibald had been doing in those last weeks by the window. She had thought he was memorizing the view. He had been running a checklist, making sure every piece was in place before he could no longer tend to it. "There's more," Ashworth said. He turned to another section of the folder. Financial records organized chronologically. joint accounts that Archibald had trusted Preston to manage for business purposes. The entries were methodical, small withdrawals at first, amounts that could be attributed to ordinary expenses, amounts that would not raise a flag. Then the numbers grew: 3,000, 8,000, 15,000. The escalation was deliberate, impatient, the work of someone who understood that the most effective theft is the kind that takes years to notice. These began approximately 3 months after Archibald's diagnosis, Ashworth said. The total removed from those accounts over that period was just under $200,000. Celestine looked at the numbers on the page. She did not speak. I want to be precise about something, Ashworth said. Thomasine initiated most of the financial activity, but Preston had signature authority on these accounts. Every transfer required his approval or his action. I want to be clear about what that means. It means he knew, Celestine said. It means he participated, Ashworth said. She said, "What do I do with all of this?" Ashworth closed the folder. "That depends on how far you want to go." "How far can I go?" "With this documentation, a long way." He picked up his coffee. "But first you need a lawyer. Caldwell already has a name for you. Zelda Lansing, elder law specialist. Archibald specifically designated her in the trust documents." "Archibald designated everything," Celestine said. There was something almost like dark humor in her voice, the register of a person processing an enormous amount of information and using irony as a temporary stabilizing mechanism. Ashworth closed the folder. He was a thorough man. Zelda Lansing's office was on the fourth floor of a building downtown. She was 58 years old, calm in the manner of someone who has navigated genuinely difficult situations and emerged with her judgment intact. She reviewed the documentation for 20 minutes without speaking. Then she set it down. "This is aggressive," she said, "and it is documented well enough to act on. But I need to tell you something before we talk strategy." Celestine waited. "They're going to file first," Lansing said. "When a target disappears unexpectedly, people like Thomasine move quickly. They try to establish legal position before the other side can respond. I expect we will hear something within the week." The call came on the fourth morning. Ashworth. 7 in the morning, his voice carrying the same flat professional tone it always carried. "They filed," he said. "Emergency guardianship petition. Filed this morning." Celestine sat up in the motel bed. "What grounds?" "Cognitive decline, inability to manage personal affairs, abandonment of residence under conditions suggesting mental instability." A brief pause. "They have a neighbor statement." "Mabel," Celestine said. "Yes." She closed her eyes for 1 second. Mabel, who had told her she knew what the other things smelled like. Mabel, who had been right and whom Thomasine had apparently found flattered and used as a witness without much difficulty. "What did she say?" "That she observed you appearing confused and disoriented in the yard on multiple occasions. That she had concerns about your ability to live independently. She saw me standing in the garden." "I know. I was looking at the roses." "I know that too." Celestine stood at the motel window. An ordinary morning, an ordinary parking lot. "Who am I seeing today?" she asked. "Dr. Sybil Elwood," Ashworth said. "Forensic psychologist. Lansing arranged it last night. Her evaluation will be the foundation of our counter to the petition." Celestine went to see Dr. Elwood that afternoon. The office was clean and sparsely furnished, the kind of space that had been deliberately stripped of anything that might influence a subject's responses. Dr. Elwood was 52, with precise posture and the manner of a person who gathered information continuously and without effort. She asked Celestine questions for 90 minutes, historical facts, logical sequences, abstract reasoning, emotional processing, current events. Celestine answered every question clearly and without hesitation. Somewhere in the middle of that 90 minutes, she felt a small, solid satisfaction at being able to demonstrate in formal terms what she had always known about herself. Her mind was entirely her own. At the end of the session, Dr. Elwood set down her pen. No indicators of cognitive decline, she said. None. Your processing is clear, your memory is intact, your executive function is normal for your age. She paused. But I want to ask you something outside the scope of the evaluation. Are you all right? I don't think all right is quite the right word, Celestine said, but I'm thinking clearly. Dr. Elwood nodded slowly. That, she said, is the most useful thing you could have told me. Preston came to the motel that same evening. Celestine heard the knock and looked through the peephole before opening the door. She opened it 2 inches. He looked for the first time in months like a person who was not managing a presentation. His hair was not quite combed. His shirt had the slightly wrinkled look of clothes put on without much attention. He looked like her son, which made it harder, not easier. We need to talk, he said. About what specifically? About all of this. Mom, you're blowing this out of proportion. The power of attorney document had a forged signature, Celestine said. My name, not my handwriting. There was a pause. It was short, no more than 2 or 3 seconds, but it was the wrong kind of pause. A man who did not know what she was referring to would have said so immediately. Preston said nothing for 2 seconds, and in that silence, Celestine heard everything she needed to hear. Thomasine is trying to organize things, he said finally. She's trying to make sure you're protected. Protected, Celestine repeated. You were alone. You were in a big house by yourself. You were struggling. I was grieving, Celestine said. There is a difference between those two things. And you know there is. He looked at her, and for a moment she saw something move through his eyes. Not cruelty, something more painful than cruelty, a kind of shame that he did not know what to do with. Come home, he said. We can figure this out. No, she said. She closed the door. She stood with her back against it and breathed in and out 3 times. Not because she was frightened, because she understood now completely and without remainder that whatever she and Preston were to each other, it would have to be rebuilt from the ground up or not at all. The version of that relationship that had existed before was gone. What came next, if anything came next, would have to be something different. She went back to the table and sat down and opened her notebook and wrote down everything she needed to do in the morning. The news that changed the shape of the hearing arrived 9 days later in 2 separate waves on the same morning. The first wave came from Mabel Radford, who appeared at Zelda Lansing's office without calling ahead. Celestine was already there reviewing documents when Mabel walked in carrying nothing. She sat down across from Lansing, looked at Celestine and said she needed to correct her statement. Lansing set down her pen. Go ahead. Mabel looked at Celestine first directly without flinching. I know what I did. I know what she used me for. She turned back to Lansing. Thomasine told me Celestine had been forgetting serious things. Leaving the stove running, getting lost on drives she'd made 100 times. I never witnessed any of that myself. What I actually saw was Celestine standing in the garden for a long while one afternoon. That was it. Thomasine explained what it meant, and I accepted the explanation without questioning it. Why are you correcting the statement now? Lansing asked. Because I found out she tried this with someone else, Mabel said. A man in Pittsburgh. His daughter found my name somehow and called me last week. Once I understood the full picture, I couldn't leave what I'd said on the record. She looked at her hands. I should have known better than to let someone hand me a conclusion and call it an observation. Lansing made careful notes. I'll need a formal amended statement before the hearing. That's why I'm here, Mabel said. After Mabel left, Celestine sat quietly at the table for a moment. She had expected to feel something dramatic at this turn. What she felt instead was something quieter and more complicated, a recognition that even the people who failed you could find their way back to the right side if the circumstances pushed them far enough. The second wave came from Ashworth, calling while Celestine was still in Lansing's office. Thomasine moved money, he said, last night from a joint account she controls. 89,500 tonners transferred to a private account we haven't been able to trace yet. That's just under the reporting threshold, Celestine said. Yes, she knows the situation is deteriorating. And there's something else. A pause. I've been in contact with Trudy Colby, Herschel's daughter in Pittsburgh. She's been trying to reopen the civil case for 2 years. With our documentation added to what she already has, the case is viable again. She's agreed to testify. Celestine stood at the window of Lansing's office and looked out at the street below. She thought about Trudy Colby in Pittsburgh, who had watched her father disappear piece by piece and then watched the law fail to hold anyone accountable, who had filed her papers and run out of money and carried that defeat for 10 years. Tell her, Celestine said, that this time she won't have to do it alone. Ashworth was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had the same flat professional tone it always carried, but there was something underneath it. There's one more thing. Caldwell called this morning. He said Archibald left something else at the bank. A second item in a separate secure box. It can only be released after all legal proceedings are resolved. Celestine held the phone and looked at the pale morning light coming through the window. Archibald, she thought, even now still one step ahead. Part 3. The hearing was set for a Thursday morning in late October, and Celestine spent the 3 days before it doing something she had not done in months. She slept, not the shallow, fragmented sleep of the motel room. Real sleep, the kind that comes when the body finally accepts that the worst has already happened, and the only direction remaining is forward. She woke each morning before the alarm made coffee sat at the small desk in the motel room, with her notebook open, and worked through what was coming with the methodical attention of a woman who had spent 46 years managing a household and understood better than most that preparation is its own form of courage. Zelda Lansing had called the night before with the final summary. The petition would be heard by Judge Alan Brockton. 62 years old, 30 years on the bench, the kind of judge who had seen enough manufactured family crises to develop a particular sensitivity to the difference between genuine concern and legal strategy dressed in the language of concern. Lansing said he was fair. She said fair was all they needed. Garrison Ashworth picked Celestine up at 7:45. They did not talk much on the drive. He drove and she looked out the window at the city moving past and thought about Archibald, not with grief this time, but with something closer to gratitude. He had built a team for her without her knowledge, a banker, a lawyer, an investigator. He had assembled the people she would need and then stepped back and trusted her to find them. The courtroom was smaller than Celestine had expected. Wood paneling, fluorescent lighting, the particular institutional smell of a room where difficult things happen with regularity. Lansing was already there when they arrived, her notes organized in precise stacks on the table. Ashworth took a seat 3 rows behind Celestine. He was there to observe and to ensure that everything that happened was accurately recorded in his own notes, an additional layer of documentation on top of everything else. Then Preston and Thomasine walked in. Celestine had not seen Thomasine since the morning in the kitchen, the morning of the forged document, and the ordinary coffee and the silence between them that contained everything. Thomasine looked exactly as she always looked. Composed. Controlled. Her expression precisely calibrated to project the appearance of a family member doing the difficult but necessary work of protecting someone she loved. If Celestine had not known what she knew, the performance would have been convincing. Preston sat down without looking at his mother. Thomasine looked at her once briefly with the expression of a person who is calculating rather than feeling. Judge Brockton entered. Everyone stood. Thomasine's attorney spoke first. His name was Garrett, mid-40s, the kind of lawyer who had learned to make concerns sound like evidence. He laid out the petition in careful language. Mrs. Saunders had left the family home without warning in a state of apparent distress. She had been living alone in a motel. There were witness statements describing confused behavior. The family was worried. He said the word safety 4 times in 8 minutes. Celestine sat at the table and listened and kept her hands flat on the surface in front of her and her face entirely still. She had learned something in the past 2 weeks that she had not known before. When you are the person being described as fragile, the most powerful thing you can do is sit in perfect stillness and let the description hang in the air and do nothing, because nothing you could say would contradict it as effectively as simply being visibly and undeniably yourself. When Garrett finished, Lansing stood. She did not raise her voice. She did not gesture dramatically. She simply stood and spoke in the tone of a person presenting facts that do not require embellishment. Your Honor, she said, what we are seeing here is not a family in distress. What we are seeing is a strategy, and the difference between those two things is documented in the materials we are about to present. She began with the forged signature. She placed a certified copy of the power of attorney document on the clerk's desk and walked the judge through the discrepancy between the signature on the document and Celestine's verified signature on file at 2 financial institutions. The difference was not subtle. It was the difference between a genuine handwriting pattern developed over a lifetime and an approximation made by someone who had seen the original a limited number of times. Thomasine's expression did not change. Garrett made a note on his legal pad. Lansing moved to the bank records. She presented the documentation of Preston and Thomasine's 3 attempts to access the trust account, including the submission of falsified beneficiary documentation, all of which the bank's legal team had reviewed and flagged before Celestine had ever walked through those glass doors. She then presented Mabel Radford's amended statement, reading the key passage aloud. I never personally observed any behavior suggesting cognitive decline. I was told what to conclude from what I saw. That is not the same as witnessing it. Garrett objected. Brockton noted the objection and allowed it to stand in the record. Then Lansing called for the video screen to be activated, and Trudy Colby appeared on it. She was 45 with the particular weariness of someone who has been carrying a heavy thing for a long time and is only now being given permission to set it down. She was in her apartment in Pittsburgh. Behind her was a bookshelf and a window with afternoon light coming through it. Lansing asked her to describe her father. Trudy said Herschel Colby had been a retired engineer, a widower for 6 years before he met Thomasine, a man who had always been sharp and careful and who had never in the 74 years of his life before 2013 shown any sign of cognitive deterioration. She described what happened after the power of attorney was signed, the gradual withdrawal from activities he had always enjoyed, the confusion that appeared without warning and then accelerated, the physicians who documented Alzheimer's in a man with no family history of the disease. She described the estate. She described filing the civil suit and running out of money and sitting in her car outside the courthouse after withdrawing the case, understanding that the system had not failed her exactly, but that it had not been designed for someone in her position. She looked at the camera and said, I recognize the name, I recognize the methods, and I want the record to show that when this happened to my father, there was no one who could do what is being done here today. The room was quiet after she finished. Garrett objected on relevance grounds. Brockton overruled him. Lansing then presented the financial records Ashworth had assembled. The withdrawals from Archibald's joint business accounts beginning 3 months after his diagnosis. Small amounts initially, then larger ones, the pattern of someone testing the tolerance of a system before committing to larger action. The total over the documented period was just under $200,000. Both Preston and Thomasine had conducted transactions from those accounts. Thomasine spoke for the first time. "Your Honor," she said, and her voice was measured and reasonable and carried precisely the right amount of restrained emotion. "This is being taken completely out of context. We were managing a complicated financial situation during a family crisis. Archibald was ill. Celestine was struggling. We were trying to hold everything together." Lansing did not look at Thomasine. She looked at the judge. "Concern," she said, "does not require a forged signature." The room absorbed that sentence. Garrett put down his pen. Preston shifted in his chair. Brockton looked at Preston. "Mr. Saunders, do you wish to address the court?" Preston stood slowly. He did not look at Thomasine. He did not look at Lansing. He looked at the judge with the expression of a man who has spent several weeks arriving at a decision he did not want to make and has finally, at the last possible moment, made it. "I'm not here to contest the petition," he said. "I'm here to withdraw it." The room shifted. "This situation," Preston continued, "was allowed to go further than it should have. I made decisions I should not have made, and I failed to stop things I should have stopped. I take responsibility for that." A pause. "I am not seeking control of any asset or account. I am not seeking guardianship. I withdraw the petition entirely." Brockton studied him for a moment. "And your position on the property and trust accounts?" "Whatever the trust documents specify," Preston said. "Whatever my mother decides." Thomasine's composure fractured. It was not dramatic. It was a small thing, a tightening around the eyes, a barely perceptible stiffening at the jaw. But Celestine had spent months learning to read Thomasine's face in the spaces where other people would not think to look, and she saw it. Brockton leaned back. He reviewed the documents in front of him for a long moment. Then he looked up. "Given the withdrawal of the petition and the evidence presented, the court finds no grounds for emergency, guardianship, or any further intervention on those grounds." He turned to the next page. "The trust and all associated assets remain under the sole authority of Celestine Saunders as specified in the original documents." Another pause. "The financial irregularities documented in these materials will be referred to the appropriate investigative authorities for review." He closed the folder. It was over. Celestine sat at the table for a moment after people began to move. The ordinary sounds of a room returning to its ordinary state filled the space around her, and she sat in the middle of it and breathed. She felt something, but it was not what she had expected to feel. She had expected relief, the specific release of a tension that had been building for months. What she felt instead was quieter than that. It was the particular stillness of a person who has been in motion for a long time and has finally stopped and is now simply present in the place where they have arrived. Lansing touched her arm lightly. "That's the legal part," she said. "The rest takes longer." Celestine nodded. She knew. She stood and turned toward the aisle, and Preston was there. He was standing at the end of the row, not blocking her path, not positioning himself to intercept her. Just standing there in the way of someone who wants to be seen but is not going to demand to be acknowledged. She stopped. "Mom," he said. His voice was low. He was not performing anything. There was no audience for this. She looked at her son. She looked at him carefully, the way you look at something you have known for a long time and are now seeing from a different angle, trying to account for all the ways the familiar thing has changed. "I didn't know about the Pittsburgh situation," he said. "I want you to know that, about who she was before." "I believe you," she said. He looked surprised. She watched the surprise move through his face and settle into something less defended. "But not knowing," she said, "is not the same as not choosing. You made choices, Preston. Every time you stayed quiet when you should have spoken, Every transfer you authorized, those were choices. I know. The petition, the months before the petition, I know. His voice was steady, but there was something underneath it that was not steady at all. I don't have an explanation that changes any of it. I only have what I'm doing now. She considered that. Then keep doing it, she said, not for me, for the person you want to be. She walked past him toward the exit. She did not look back. Outside the courthouse, the air was cold and clean, and Celestine stood on the steps for a moment and let it reach her. Thomasine was waiting near the bottom of the steps, not with softness, not with anything that resembled reconciliation. She was standing with the specific quality of stillness that belongs to a person who is deciding how to use the last of a diminishing resource. Abigail, she said. She had never been able to keep the name straight when she was rattled. Celestine, Celestine said. Thomasine looked at her steadily. You understand that without Preston, you have nothing left in that direction. Whatever you think you have won today, you go home alone tonight. Yes, Celestine said. The word stopped Thomasine. I know that, Celestine continued. I've known it since I pulled that suitcase out the front door. I went to a $49 motel room alone, and I was fine. You mistook my willingness to accept solitude for a weakness. It isn't one. Thomasine said nothing. The calculation behind her eyes ran its course and found no purchase. You should speak with your attorney, Celestine said. The referral to the investigative authorities was not a formality. She walked down the steps and did not pause. Ashworth was waiting at the car. He opened the passenger door without being asked. Caldwell called, he said as she got in. About the second item Archibald left. He says you can come by any time. Now that proceedings are concluded, it can be released. Celestine looked out the windshield at the courthouse steps, at the ordinary street beyond it, at the afternoon moving through its ordinary hours. Tomorrow, she said, I want one night where nothing new happens. Ashworth started the car. Understood. They drove in silence for a few minutes. Then Celestine said, Trudy Colby, what happens to her case now? With our documentation added and Thomasine now under federal review, the Pittsburgh civil case has grounds to reopen. Trudy's attorney has already been in contact with Lansing. He changed lanes. It won't be fast, but it will move. Celestine thought about Trudy on the video screen with the afternoon light behind her describing what it had felt like to run out of money before running out of truth. She thought about the decade Trudy had carried that loss without resolution. Tell Lansing, Celestine said, that I want to contribute to Trudy's legal costs, whatever she needs to see it through. Ashworth glanced at her. That's generous. It's practical, Celestine said. If we stop Thomasine for good, we stop her for everyone she would have found next. That seems worth paying for. They pulled up to the motel. Celestine got out and stood for a moment in the cold air. The afternoon light was falling at a low angle across the parking lot, the particular quality of October light that makes everything look slightly more significant than it is. She went inside, sat down at the small desk, and opened her notebook to a fresh page. At the top of the page, she wrote what comes next. And for the first time since she had left that house in the rain, the question felt like an invitation rather than a problem. The second item Archibald had left at the bank was a small wooden box made from dark walnut with a brass latch that had been polished recently, as if someone had tended to it in anticipation of this moment. Caldwell set it on his desk the following morning and placed a small brass key beside it without ceremony. He had the good sense to understand that this was not a moment that required narration. Celestine picked up the key. The latch opened on the first try. Inside the box were two things. The first was a photograph, 8 by 10, printed on good paper, the color still vivid. It showed Celestine and Archibald standing on the observation deck at Niagara Falls in the summer of 2018, the mist rising behind them, Archibald's arm around her shoulders. She was laughing at something. He was not looking at the falls or the camera. He was looking at her. She had not known anyone took this photograph. She had no memory of a photographer, no recollection of anyone asking them to pose. Archibald had arranged it without telling her, had hired someone to capture this particular moment in this particular place, and had kept the photograph in a bank vault for 2 years because he wanted her to have it when she needed it most. On the back, in his handwriting, in case you need to remember why all of this was worth doing. The second item was a single sheet of paper folded once. She unfolded it. It said, "If you are reading this, you won." I never doubted it for a moment. Celestine sat in Fletcher Caldwell's office and held those two pieces of paper and that photograph. And the feeling that moved through her was not grief, and it was not relief, and it was not the complicated gratitude she had felt when she read the first letter. It was something she did not have a word for exactly. It was the feeling of being fully known by another person, of having been seen clearly and completely, and of understanding that this seeing had been one of the organizing facts of your life, even when you had not been paying attention to it. She put the photograph and the note back in the wooden box and closed the latch. "I'd like to open a new account," she said to Caldwell. "A separate one in my name only. I want to fund an initiative I'm setting up. Legal services for elderly individuals facing financial exploitation by family members." Caldwell looked at her for a moment. "I can have the paperwork ready this afternoon." "Good," she said. She stood and picked up the box in her purse. "Thank you, Mr. Caldwell, for everything you did before I walked through that door." He nodded. "Your husband made it straightforward. He wanted you protected. We were glad to be part of that." She walked out of the bank into the October morning, carrying the wooden box under her arm, and for the first time since this had all begun, she felt the particular lightness of a person who was no longer waiting for something to happen. Mabel Radford appeared at the motel the following afternoon. She did not call ahead. She brought zucchini bread in a paper bag, which was the only form of apology Mabel had ever been able to articulate, and she stood at the door of room 7 with the expression of a woman who has made her decision and is not going to soften it with preamble. Celestine opened the door fully. "I know," Mabel said immediately. "I know what I did. I know what she used me for. And I know that amending my statement doesn't undo what I said in the first one." "No," Celestine agreed. "It doesn't. So I'm not here to make myself feel better." Mabel held out the paper bag. "I'm here because you're still my neighbor of 22 years, and because I was wrong, and because I don't know how to say any of that without also bringing something to eat." Celestine took the bag. She stepped back from the door. They sat at the small desk in the motel room and ate zucchini bread on paper napkins, and Mabel talked for a while about what Thomasine had said to her, how it had been framed, how the conversation had seemed reasonable and caring from the inside. She was trying to understand how she had been moved without feeling moved. Celestine listened without explaining the mechanics of it, because some things are more useful as shared experience than as analysis. "She told me you'd been forgetting things," Mabel said. "She made it sound like she was protecting you. And I wanted to believe that someone was, because I knew you were alone and I hadn't been doing enough." "You told me the truth that first afternoon," Celestine said. "In my kitchen with the zucchini bread. I just wasn't ready to hear it." Mabel looked at her. "You could have been angrier with me." "I could have been," Celestine said. "But anger seemed like a waste of what I have left to spend." They finished the bread. Mabel left. Celestine stood at the window after the door closed and watched Mabel's car pull out of the parking lot, and thought that there were people in your life who failed you in small ways and people who failed you in large ones, and that the distinction mattered, and that forgiveness, when it came, had to account for both the size of the failure and the weight of the intention behind it. She called Pastor Kimball that evening. He answered on the second ring. "I remembered what you said," she told him, "after the funeral, about grief making people suggestible. I was thinking about you when I said it, he said. I knew what I was worried about. I wasn't sure I had the standing to say it more directly. You didn't need standing. You needed to say it. A pause. You're right. I'm sorry I didn't. I'm calling because I want you to know it turned out all right, she said. Not because I need you to know, but because you were one of the people who tried even quietly, and those people deserve to hear when things go the right way. He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had something in it that she recognized as the sound of genuine emotion in a man who had spent 30 years learning to hold it professionally. Thank you for telling me, he said. Are you well? I'm better than I've been in a long time, she said. And it was true. She found the house in Michigan on a Tuesday morning through an online listing that Lansing had forwarded with a note that said, simply look at this one. It was a cottage on the Upper Peninsula near a lake that was large enough to have weather of its own, small enough that you could see the far shore on a clear day. 2 rooms, a kitchen, a porch facing the water. The floors were wood-worn smooth by decades of use. The kitchen had a window above the sink that looked out at a stand of birch trees. She drove up on a Wednesday alone and walked through the rooms in the afternoon quiet and stood on the porch for a long time looking at the water. A pair of loons were moving near the far shore, their calls carrying across the surface in the thin autumn air. She made an offer that afternoon from the parking lot of a gas station 2 miles down the road. The offer was accepted by the following morning. She listed the Columbus house that same week through a real estate attorney Lansing recommended. The sale closed 3 weeks later. Celestine received the notification by email at the cottage in Michigan, sitting at the kitchen table with her first cup of coffee of the morning, the birch trees visible through the window above the sink. She read the notification, closed her phone, and looked at the trees for a moment. Then she got up and refilled her coffee and started planning the afternoon. The Saunders Initiative, as she had decided to call it, was formally established in the first week of November. Lansing structured the legal framework. Ashworth, who had agreed to consult on an ongoing basis, drafted a protocol for intake and investigation. Celestine wrote the mission statement herself, sitting at the kitchen table late one evening with the lake invisible in the darkness outside and only the sound of water to keep her company. The language was simple. Financial exploitation of elderly individuals by family members was not rare. It was not unusual. It happened consistently in ordinary families to people who had done nothing to invite it except to be old and to trust the people closest to them. The Saunders Initiative would provide legal consultation, investigative support, and direct referral to attorneys for individuals who could not afford to pursue these cases alone. She named it Saunders because the name belonged to both of them and because what Archibald had built and what she had survived were equally part of what the initiative represented. The first inquiry came in during the second week of December, forwarded by Lansing from a woman in Dayton whose son and daughter-in-law had been managing her finances for 18 months. The second came the week after from a man in Cleveland whose daughter had taken power of attorney under circumstances that did not hold up to scrutiny. By the end of the first year, the initiative had handled 14 cases across 3 states. Trudy Colby called in January to say that the Pittsburgh civil case had been formally reopened and that her attorney was cautiously optimistic. She said cautiously because she had been through this before and she had learned to measure hope carefully. Celestine told her that careful was the right way to do it. They talked for 40 minutes. By the end of the conversation, Trudy had agreed to serve as an advisory board member for the initiative specifically on case intake. You're the only person in the world, Trudy said before they hung up, who understands exactly what that waiting felt like. I know, Celestine said. That's why I called you first. Preston's first letter arrived in the third week of November. Celestine left it on the kitchen table for 4 days before opening it. Not because she was angry and not as a deliberate strategy. She simply needed the distance between the legal resolution and this moment to be long enough that she could read what he had written without her response being determined by everything that had come immediately before. When she finally opened it, she read it twice. He did not make excuses. He did not reframe what had happened or assign percentages of blame to Thomasine or to circumstance. He described in plain language what he had done and what he had failed to do. He wrote about the transfers, about the guardianship petition, about the months of watching and participating and telling himself it was temporary. He wrote that temporary had been a word he had used to avoid facing what it actually was. He did not ask for forgiveness in those terms. He asked only for acknowledgement that he was trying to become someone different from the person who had stood in that doorway and said 4 words to the floor while his mother walked out into the rain. Celestine put the letter in the drawer of the kitchen table and went for a walk along the lake. The second letter came in December, shorter than the first. 7 lines. He was seeing a therapist. He had found work at a smaller firm than where he had been. He was not asking for anything. He wrote, "I am still here, and I understand if that is not relevant to you right now." She put that letter in the drawer with the first one. The third letter arrived in February on a Thursday when the lake was frozen to the near shore and the birch trees were bare against a white sky. She made tea before she opened it and sat down at the kitchen table and read it slowly. He wrote about what the therapy had uncovered, about the years his father had been absent, and what that absence had deposited in him, a particular kind of hunger for control that he had not recognized as hunger until he saw it clearly in someone else's behavior and understood that it had also been his own. He wrote that understanding a thing and being forgiven for it were not the same, and that he was not conflating them. He wrote that he did not expect to come back into her life in any form resembling what had existed before. The last paragraph was short. He wrote, "I hope one day there is some version of a relationship between us that is honest. I don't know what that looks like. I'm not asking you to figure it out. I'm just telling you that I'm still working on being worth knowing in case that ever matters." Celestine sat at the kitchen table for a long time after finishing the letter. The lake was still outside the window. The tea had gone cold. She got up and put the kettle on again. She found a sheet of good paper in the drawer, the heavy cream-colored kind she had bought at a stationery store in town, and she found a pen that wrote without hesitation. She wrote for about 10 minutes. Then she read it back once, folded it, and put it in an envelope. What she had written was not forgiveness exactly, because forgiveness is not a thing that can be given on a schedule or in response to the right number of letters. What she had written was an acknowledgement. She told him she had read what he wrote, and she believed that he was trying. She told him that trust, when it was rebuilt, would be rebuilt slowly on the basis of what he did rather than what he intended, and that there was no timeline for that and no guarantee of the destination. She told him the door was not closed. She told him to take care of himself. She sealed the envelope and set it on the counter by the door. Then she poured fresh tea and went to sit on the porch, bundled in her winter coat, and looked at the frozen lake. The sky was the particular gray of a February afternoon in the Upper Peninsula, heavy with the potential of more snow. A crow landed on the dock railing and regarded her with the frank curiosity of a creature that does not waste time on self-consciousness. She looked back at it. After a moment, it flew away. She thought about the night she had stood in the rain with the gray suitcase. She had believed in those minutes that she was standing at an ending. She had believed that what Preston had said to the floor and what Thomasine's silence had said and what the rain had said were all saying the same thing, which was that a chapter of her life was closing and there was nothing on the other side of it. What she understood now was that she had been right about the ending and entirely wrong about what it meant. The chapter that had closed was not the chapter of her life. It was the chapter in which she had been waiting for other people to determine what her life would contain. That chapter had ended in the rain on that driveway, and it had not reopened. What had come after was not a new chapter in the old story. It was a different story entirely built from what Archibald had left her and what she had done with it, built from the decisions she had made in a motel room, in a bank office, in a courtroom, built from the letters she had written and the foundation she had established. And the calls she had taken from women in Dayton and men in Cleveland who needed someone to tell them that what was happening to them was real and that it was not their fault and that there was something that could be done. She put her hands around the tea mug and felt the warmth come through the ceramic into her palms. The wooden box from the bank was on the kitchen table inside. She had looked at the photograph many times in the weeks since Caldwell had given it to her, and each time she looked at it, she saw something slightly different. Not because the photograph changed, because she did. In the photograph, Archibald was not looking at the falls or at the camera. He was looking at her. He had always been better at that than she had given him credit for. He had looked at her clearly across 46 years, and he had seen what was coming before she had, and he had built what she needed to face it and then trusted her to find it. That trust had been the most important thing he had ever given her. Not the money, not the lawyer or the investigator or the meticulous documentation. The trust that she could handle the truth and the decision to make sure the truth was available to her when she needed it. She thought, I want to be someone who does that for other people. The crow came back to the dock railing, or perhaps it was a different crow. She could not tell, and it did not especially matter. The snow that the sky had been promising began to fall. Light at first, the flakes spaced far apart and unhurried, drifting down through the still air and settling on the dock and the frozen surface of the lake without sound. Celestine watched it fall. She finished her tea. She did not go inside immediately. There was something about sitting in the quiet and the cold and the snow that felt earned in a way that warmth inside a house could not replicate. Not because suffering is valuable in itself, but because the ability to sit in the difficulty of a thing without needing to escape, it is a form of strength. And she had worked hard for that strength, and she was not going to waste it by rushing inside before she was ready. She sat until the snow had covered the dock railing in a thin white line. Then she stood, picked up the empty mug, and went inside to make dinner. Tomorrow she would mail the letter to Preston. Tomorrow Lansing would call with an update on the third case. The initiative was managing a woman in Indianapolis whose stepchildren had been systematically transferring assets for 14 months. Tomorrow, Trudy Colby's attorney would file the next brief in the Pittsburgh case, and somewhere in a federal office, a file with Thomasin's name on it would move one step further through the process that had been set in motion the morning Celestine walked into a bank with a blue card and nothing else. All of that was tomorrow. Tonight, the snow was falling on the lake, and the kitchen was warm, and the wooden box sat on the table with the handsome photograph inside it, and Celestine Saunders, 68 years old, was exactly where she had chosen to be. That was enough. That was more than enough.